it doesn't allow for an intelligent solution.
David, do you think intelligence can come in, though, when there is emotional confusion, conflict, several emotions going on at the same time?
Well, that's what we have to explore. You see, the first point is to realize that in these cases which cause trouble, the emotions are secondary to the thought. In fact, you could say the thought and the emotions are one process, which goes on outward into the state of the body and outward into the action and so on. It comes back. And the fragmentation consists of, of treating them as all different. Now, therefore, you see, when we find the inappropriate emotions, either we may say we could try to control them, or we might say they're quite appropriate, saying that these people, the typical situation between nations is that various people, and some sort of massacre occurs, and people are justifiably very angry, and then this leads to a counter-massacre, and then the other side is justifiably very angry, and so on and so on. Now, it would seem that it would be quite right to get angry at somebody massacring your people, and for the first burst of anger it might make sense, but remaining angry like that can do nothing but keep it going. In other words, to remain angry could only be done by thinking that you are justified.
But are you suggesting that there is some way from within a system that has momentum and energy rolling along, that within that system you can see something that can alter the direction? Doesn't it normally, wouldn't it seem that it would have to be something outside the system that could see it?
Well, there would have to be an intelligence outside, but I think that somewhat, to some extent, even within the system, you could see it, because, when you begin to sense that the emotions are inappropriate, you could then begin to ask, what are the thoughts behind it? You see if you can find the thoughts behind it. In other words, if it's outside the system, we don't know quite how to get there.
But if we're already angry or frightened, or our two nations are sort of rattling sabers, are we going to be able to ask that question?
Well, as individuals, we should be able to ask it.
Yeah.
Well,
some individuals.
It's really difficult, though, to ask that question when one's in the grip of a strong emotion. To think straight is very difficult.
Yeah. Well,
that's a problem, isn't it?
Yes, I think that, suppose it may be too difficult at a certain moment, but let's come to the case of something less strong, where you get angry at somebody, as the example, that they treat you badly, or that they don't seem to respect you or to take your needs into account. And it would seem, like saying in the example that they keep you waiting for a couple of hours, and it seems and then you find they had no good reason. And you can get very angry. For that moment, okay, but then it will sort of calm down now, but it's still there because it's on the thought process, right? The thought is that you have been badly treated, and you have good reason to be angry, a valid reason. Now, you can ask, is it a valid reason? You can first see that if you go on with this, it's just going to create more and more trouble that you don't want. It's not a coherent behavior.
More wounds.
Yes.
More woundedness.
Yes, and you really don't want it. But you're going to produce results that you don't want. Now then, you could say, is it valid to go on, to accept? So, if the person treated me badly, is that a valid reason to be angry? Is it always a valid reason to be angry?
You might want to stop the person from treating you badly, so you'd have to find a way of doing that.
Yeah, so you see, if in the first burst of anger may be helpful in one moment to let the person know that he's treating you badly, but see, if it goes on and festers and so on, then obviously it doesn't make sense.
Does not making sense ever deter anyone?
Well, it does in some cases, not often.
Or I just think of a case like in the Persian War. I mean, many of my friends said, we're being totally rational and sensible. This is a very dangerous man. He probably has the bomb. And so, he won't listen. You can't just go talk to him nicely. So the only sort of rational response is to attack, have war against him. And I think, it's doing rationally.
My question, I guess, is seeing that I'm irrational, does that make any difference?
Well, I think it can actually, but if the emotion is too strong, it won't. But in many cases, it can. If you keep on seeing it. See, I would say that what I'm suggesting, though, is first of all to not try to change this thing, but rather to try to see how it works. See, by saying, if you find the reason why you're angry, you'll see that the repetition of the reason to yourself will build up the anger. So you can see the thing working more slowly, you see. So, and you see the anger affecting how you think. Now, in some cases, it will be possible for the anger to come to stop just by seeing that it's going to get you in trouble, but in other cases it won't. But
question of priorities, isn't it? And values. Most people value what it is that they're angry about over seeing whether it can change. We don't give much value to changing as much as we do to protect.
Right. I think the major point is to see that it's not coherent. You see that you're not getting what you want out of it. You're getting a result that you don't expect and don't want.
You have to give a high order to coherence.
Yes.
Okay. My question is, what is I know you can't answer, but what is the agency of change? Is rational thought an agency of change?
Not by itself, no. But I think that you can begin with rational thought, begin to see how this thing works.
Well, but it's an interesting point when you say that you see it rationally and it doesn't change. That's typically true. And then you say rational thought alone won't change it. Well, then what? Can we keep looking with rational thought even when it's not working, without expecting it to work? It seems that the problem is there, that in how we see what's going on, also seeing that rational thought doesn't do it, and still to keep on looking at it somehow.
Are we looking with rational thought then, or is that something
Well,
else?
that's it's not clear. And it seems that if you keep on there, you might begin to find out if there's something other than rational thought that would look.
What's so rational about a thought that sees something and doesn't change things? Why do we call it rational?
I couldn't hear you.
Why do we call that rational thought when we have a feeling that we've seen the reality of something, but something doesn't change? That doesn't seem very rational at all.
Well, that may be the next point.
So
But
maybe we're not having rational thought at all. We're calling it rational thought and saying it doesn't work.
More than likely.
It seems to me that a tension might be a better way of looking at this. If there's a clear attention to what is happening and the ramifications of the irrational action, what it leads to, and what the effects are. I think if that's seen clearly, then there's at least a high probability that there would be a rational thought.
Implied in the word rational thought is that there's a kind of intelligence, awareness, and perception of these facts, and out of that, one thinks something would act intelligently. say rational thought sees something and still something doesn't change, that's a contradiction in terms. The very fact that if you did have a truly rational thought, you would change something. So what we're saying is we don't have rational thoughts, we just call certain things rational.
Yes, they may appear to be rational up to a point, but we don't see the whole process.
We forget about our bodies, don't we? Because all of this has a physiological effect. The adrenaline starts going around and driving one. I mean, that's part of the program, it seems.
Yes, well, we don't see the process which keeps us going on with something that is incoherent, that will produce results we don't want.
Part of the rational thought would be to see that when we do see the reality of something, we don't act, what you use the word, coherently. That would be the next step in this rational thinking. Right? Saying, now I see that even when I do perceive what really appears to be the reality of the situation, there isn't a corresponding intelligent action.
Yes. Yes. Well, what are we missing?
Yeah. There must be things that come up and enter into, and factor into it that, like I say, shunt off the energy or diffuse the energy or a self-protective action or something, which we hold a higher value to than rationality. That would be the next
but yes.
It's what's missing. To me, I think that's probably a better question than where is the source of the problem. Is assuming that we are the way we are and that human beings are going to behave as human beings have always done, there's something that can be added to it developmentally. I mean, maybe we develop naturally up to a point, develop biologically up to a point, and then there's something more that has another level that has to be laid on to it to bring coherence to the whole thing, and that's what we haven't experienced.
Yes.
Or at least not as a culture, so-called enlightened people who claim to have some semblance of this, but their influence doesn't seem to be powerful enough to change anyone else or change very many other people. So it means that there's something more. So what's the missing link, as it were, that hasn't arrived yet in any large way?
David, I wonder if you would, at this point, talk about the concept of self. I think that it seems that, if you're in the eye of the storm, and you want to have rational thought, and everything is of an absolute necessity that I am number one.
Yes.
Then, unless you approach that point and talk about that point, I don't see how it's possible to have any rational thought.
Can I ask you?
It just seems to me that it will always come back to being one step away from the crux of it. And the crux of it is, we all know if we're very hungry, we're going to want to have the food that's over there. And somewhere along the line in the transition of mankind, the intellectual portion developed, and so, okay, here we are with this society, and we're, supposedly intellectual beings, but we're not intellectual beings. You look around at the devastation of mankind, and the technological advances seem very unimportant considering how many people are suffering. So my point is that with the depth that you've gone into this in the past, I just wonder if we could talk for a moment about how that eye of the storm is approached. How that concept of I am an absolute necessity, my needs are.
Yes. Yes, well, see, the first point is that the notion of necessity will carry tremendous power, even greater than the emotions. Necessity is what cannot be otherwise, but it's also, it won't turn aside, it's unyielding. And if it's necessary, then you have a kind of rigidity, or at least if it's really necessary, then you shouldn't be turned aside easily. So we have thoughts of all sorts of orders of necessity, and we establish priorities that way by saying this is necessary, but it's limited. it's contingent, it depends on something. And then something else may be necessary on which this depends. And so there are various orders of priority. And we have then the absolute supreme priority of the self, which would override everything else. Now,
what if the self is in fact an abstraction of thought?
It could be an abstraction of thought, but you see, we are experiencing it as very concrete, right? As very real.
Right, and then its survival becomes the overriding absolute necessity, which is why we can't seem to break out of the loop.
Yes.
It's a very uncomfortable concept.
It's one that I find fascinating, but the difficulty in coming back with it seems that everyone has always had this problem. I mean, it isn't. I can't find any sort of culture that, as you say, the so-called primitive culture that has its word for human being, meaning just the members of its own tribe. It's an expansion. What would you call it? A wego. A slightly expanded self. This need for a self seems to be so universal that it could be hardwired in some way. And yet there's something, I think, very interesting in that question.
Yes, well, if the self were a genuine necessity in the way we experience it, then it would be insoluble. I mean, in other words, we would really be doomed to unending frustration.
Is there a continuity that arises out of our sensing that I mean, it seems to me that what we're calling self is an inferential self. That's where continuity occurs, in the thought of self. I'm not sure if it's given in the actual immediacy of our experience.
Nevertheless, it seems to be immediate. That is, that if the self is hurt, the pain seems immediate, right? Also, the self which experiences it appears to be immediate. Right?
See many examples where this so-called self and self-preservation seems to be given up to a higher order or a higher value. Why is it possible for this self to exist and give a higher value to the truth of the matter? At least that'd be a good place to start. But
yeah.
The highest value to the protection of itself, and everything is a threat or everything is an aggrandizement, and we just live in a very narrow realm of possibilities. But if a person would say, well, this self exists or it doesn't exist, that's not the problem. The problem is whether I'm interested in the truth of the matter, which would be a higher order of questioning and perception. That's all we're asked to do, is to say, look, can we look at this thing in a way that doesn't evoke the self-protection or the self-aggrandizement that this self thing seems to have? And we don't. That's the only way we can come to the question, is say, am I interested enough to see the truth, not to let self-protection be the highest word?
Yes, well, sometimes people do that, but other times they don't, right?
But by holding that thought, at least give a person some place from which to start perceiving what's the truth. Otherwise, it's all self-protection, or it's all and that's what we're being asked, is where do we stand in order to get a feeling for the reality of the situation? It seems to me that we say, if the truth is valid, I want it to be exceedingly valid. It seems to be quite distorted now. If it's not valid, whatever it is that we perceive it, we'd like to know the truth of the matter too. So automatically there's a place to stand to ask the question.
Mm-hmm. One of the problems might be that I'd like to know the truth of the matter now and then.
Well, that's sort of like saying, we have a word for that. It's called bullshit.
It also might be that knowing the truth of the matter might, once, whatever that means to an individual, might be okay if you're just on your own. But when you're with other people and communicating, we all have different ideas of what the truth is, and people get into the worst fights about that than anything
that's
else.
one of the truths of the matter, is that we have different ideas.
But
And
we have
if we
to
hold our
communicate
ideas
together.
to be the most powerful and the most important, then that's why we have these problems. That's just simple. We don't have to get real excited. But we say, look, when I'm with people, it's very difficult for me to be honest. I'm guarded. I'm self-protected. It's automatically being displayed. I go, oh, well, I have reason to be. No, I'm just interested in the truth. Maybe that's far-fetched. I guess that's what I'm being told. This is a pretty far-fetched idea. But to me, it seems to be the only way. People always ask the question, where do you find a place to stand or a perspective that isn't of the problem? And everybody says trying to get out of the problem is of the problem. So I say, why don't you just give a higher order? I mean, you see people dying, throwing themselves in front of tanks for a belief system. They seem to somehow be able to get beyond the self-preservation in absurd ways to my mind. But it shows that it can be done. So why can't we do it in a nice, harmonious, easy-going way where nobody's holding a gun or getting having a conversation?
But I think it also shows that it won't really work, because one can have a priority to have a higher value to something else, but it'll be caught up in the same problem. I mean, the young man who throws himself in front of the tank, say, or who dies for some reason, has elevated some idea to a higher position, but it somehow is the same thing.
In that respect, it is. I'm just saying that obviously it must be possible to hold a higher idea than self-protection. If the higher idea was to see the truth, that might be of some value. Throw yourself in front of a tank for an ideal has no value.
Well, to come back to that point for a minute, you made the point a moment ago that the implication seemed to be that if you only felt inclined to see the truth now and then, that there's something phony or, as you said, bullshit about that. But I'm not sure. It seems to me that if even once you really wanted to see the truth about something, that's of inestimable value. And if it were 4 times, that would be 4 times greater. And that there's a risk of saying, I have to be so perfect that I have to want to see the truth all the time, or the little times that I want to see it are really not true and really phony. And that may not be right.
To say I want to see it all the time would be the ultimate.
It might, yeah. But that's implication of that seemed to be floating
well,
around.
right. It was just that it sort of was a clever way of getting out of the question, I thought. If you saw the truth of the matter once, then you have to have some impression of it.
Well, it might, but if you, a little bit might be okay. A little bit might be better than nothing. And often I think that, and I don't mean you, all of us tend to feel that we have to have a total insight, or it's all something that we've just contrived. And we might really be cheating ourselves very deeply if we take that view.
It seems to me that a lot of what we want to be happening in the world, kind of like what you said, I think there is a space, being created. I think about my son, who was my second son, who was born rather traumatically, and his sense of separation and fragmentation was obvious from the beginning. He was just barely out of the womb, and he had the most frightened look of separation ever. And I think everybody's birth is the most obvious thing that, we all like to say we're one, but hell, we're fragmented. There's you, and there's you, and there's you, and there's me. And our birth really shoved this in our faces. And I think thought is definitely fragmentary in and of itself. I think thought has a paradoxical function. I think thought confirms us in our fragment, the fragment that we are. And we build these thoughts around this fragment, which we later on call our ego. And this protects us, It's paradoxical in that it keeps us fragmented, and it protects us, and it provides us a space. It creates something like we're doing, right now, where even though thought is all fragmentary, somehow it's produced an effort to come together. And I think the whole thing of birth and being human this is like creation becoming self-consciously and shamefully aware of how great each human being is, in the sense that we are really all one and we are all infinite. And that's too much to ask of any mere human, to accept how great a thing that we're all involved in. And to me, it's like a really mystical event, being a human being. And I think the thought, we need to protect ourselves with this fragmentation. And I think, paradoxically, I think it's going to deliver us. It has a function.
Well, unless it destroys us first, but how will it deliver us?
How will it deliver us? It's like it's the only thing we have. Language is all fragmentary. Every concept is delimited. You said that the thought distinguishes itself from what is, from what the other. We don't know how to do other, I don't think. I haven't seen any other way to communicate. I mean, it'd be nice if we could sit with somebody and just go, but I don't have to do that. There's some people who do, but I don't. So we have thought and we have language. But
maybe it's not fragmentation that will deliver us, but individuality or genuine independence of some kind.
For sure, whatever it is.
Well, see, that's what we're saying. The fragmentation is an arbitrary and false division. Or to distinguishing that from...
I totally believe that fragmentation is arbitrary and false. It's just that when we're born, I mean, in psychology, they say how healthy it is for even as a teenager, gets to their own identity. They have to separate themselves from the parent. I mean, it's this human process that we go through of separating ourselves and establishing this identity, which certainly is false. But for somehow it's like we're cursed with this process, for better or for worse. And while you may believe that it's all one, and the separation is false, let's face it, there is this thing, at least that we can talk about, and there is fragmentation, even though it might be an illusion. But I think, in a sense, it's going to deliver us because it's holding the space right here, I think.
I don't know if you can say certainly it's false, and at the same time say it's going to deliver us. There may be an aspect of it which is valid, which will deliver us, but the aspect which is certainly false is not going to deliver us.
You could. That's like denying paradox. You take a line. A line is very distinguishable, but when it goes out at both ends, it goes into infinity, and there isn't anybody who can conceive of infinity. So the line destroys itself. Thought will destroy itself because fragmentation just cannot stand on its own. It will break apart, just like it says. If we all fall into fragments, then the fragments have no more meaning, and we discover that we're all one. It's a paradox, but you have to, you can't deny the paradox.
Maybe that's what's happening in the world. I mean, maybe what we're saying is that thoughts hit that point where it can't survive any longer in this fragment. Saying we're products of thought, so we're going to go down the tubes with it. I mean, that's not a very sort of enjoyable thought, but it follows from what you're suggesting.
Well, it follows logically, but from what I'm saying and what I'm feeling is just the opposite of that. I mean, what I feel and what I see is exactly the way you would think. But logically, sure, it doesn't follow. But I don't know how to talk in language and not be contradictory. And, logic has the power. Reasonableness, rationalness has the power of defending any position. But it's not about winning, and it's not about positions. That's the weird, contradictory paradox of thought. There is no such thing as a rational thought. That's irrational to begin with, because if thought is fragmentary, how can it be real? And how can it be rational? Our very words are contradictions. But this is human conversation, and this is how we do it.
But would you accept the possibility that yes, it has a place, a positive place, that we're able to talk and that you need to separate from your mother and so on, but that it also is having a very in some ways it's being very destructive, and it's
absolutely. I mean,
so
to me, that's the biggest pain,
right.
to see the polarization. I mean, I teach in high school, and we're in a public school where these kids are not listened to. They're pushed aside. There's so much fear of gangs and drugs that the thought that they conceive of these things controls these children. These children are not heard. It's terribly fragmented, and it makes us suffer so much and causes so much pain. Absolutely.
But do you think we could explore the possibility of how the fragmentation, how the divisions go wrong? What ways the division is incorrect?
Yeah, I guess, but I just kind of think of this creation. I think of it's almost like God becoming aware of Himself, or it's almost like the awareness of us is too much to take all at once. It's almost like it's our way of giving it to ourselves, our wonderful reality in small doses, some painful doses, maybe, I don't know. But I don't think that, it's almost like saying it went wrong. How do you know it went wrong? Maybe this painful process, it seems like it's the way it's supposed to be because it is. In ways, and certainly we want to look for joy and we want to look for love, but there is pain.
Well, what you said about position seems to me very important in winning. It seems to me we live in a very masculine world. And role and position are extremely important ways of defining oneself as a man in a masculine world. And women actually have another way of defining themselves, something that's more important than role and position, or at least position and winning.
Which is that way.
At least to women. Yes.
Which is what?
Well, connecting. Sorry, mutter. What? I didn't hear it. Sorry, what did you say?
Well, I would like to know this way that women have. That's different than men. I notice women like being mothers.
I would really like to get back to what David started out talking about and hear which direction he would like to start going in this dialogue this weekend. I for one, feel like it's getting way off the track, and David has really not finished what he was going to say.
Yes, well, I think the points that were raised are very interesting, valid. But I think that if we just say thought is fragmentary and that's it, then what will we do from there on? See, my own feeling is that fragmentation is a situation where we make a division which is inappropriate. As I've said, that division is a perfectly appropriate thing to make, a distinction. There's a distinction which means things are not actually separate, but you merely mark them apart, and there's a division where they're really apart. And of course we say it's all ultimately united, but when it comes to actual life, it is necessary, as you were pointing out, to that, say, the child must separate from its parents because it has a false unification. You see, unification is not necessarily always right. That things which are not united are taken to be held to be united, and things which are not divided are held to be divided. That's what I call fragmentation. And now that's the source of the irrationality. I think that it is possible, if there's intelligence, for thought to make to be able to keep in order, you see, to keep coherent this difference between divisions which are appropriate and divisions which are not. Now, not fully so, because there's always going to be a when it comes to the self, we find that this is particularly, that this can't be done. Right? That we find that that the absolute necessity is so powerful that people are driven to divide things just in accordance with the needs of the self, the apparent needs of the self, and to unite them in accordance with those needs. But the self is established by thought too. I mean, the limits of the self. So I think it's worth going into this and seeing how and getting more insight into it.
How would you answer the point that we look at the world and why should you say there's anything wrong with it? It is what it is.
Oh.
Maybe it had to be that way, and why call it wrong?
Well, we won't call it wrong, but I didn't want to say, we say that it's not, we are producing results that we don't intend and we don't want, right? Now, that's all I'm saying. Now, it would seem then that we could raise the question of whether we can get results closer to what we intend and want. Now, what we mean by wrong is only that it's not working that way. Now, see, it certainly would be good if we could, for example, get rid of some of these problems of nationalism and be able to get together on the ecology and so on. See, if we don't, then it seems we're going to face some very difficult things, or possibly extinction. And so, can we do something there? You see, I think that we would have to get, in some way, to end thought, to raise the point you were raising, to operate from beyond thought in some way. But we can't do that on purpose, I don't. That purpose is already in thought, huh?
Wouldn't to come to that point of view, wouldn't you need to have not only a theoretical sense that there is a limit to thought, but some direct experience that it's necessary to find the limit of thought? It seems that we talk about this a great deal, but very little happens. And perhaps tomorrow we could go into the difference between that as a description, the limit of thought, and that as a comprehension, a direct, concrete experience.
Yeah.
It's probably too late to go into that now, but I, for one, would be very interested at some point over the weekend to look at that point.
Yes. Well, perhaps we could pursue this whole thing tomorrow, starting in the morning. Are there any other points anybody would like to raise in the last minute?
If we are watching, if we start watching, first of all, we have to see, are we happy for what's happening in our lives? It's a very important question. And if we put that question really seriously, then, and the answer may come, no, we are not. Then we could say, well, where is the deepest cause? Then we may start watching, and as you said, already we are coming closer to find that the enemy and the cause is in the process of our thinking. Then the fragmentation, and I'm glad you brought the point out, we're not going to bless the fragmentation as something that it is a necessity, but it is a distraction. The fragmentation is nothing to do, as David said, individual. It's not a distinction. It is really a terrible distraction, the fragmentation. And that is in the process of the thinking, but we never thought about it before. Then we got to start watching closer and closer through that kind of a dialogue. As the awareness comes up, or the insight happening, that it is so tricky, our thought, our thinking, so really cunning and canine, but And that kind of idealism, I personally found it many times that it is again a self-importance. I may throw myself in front of the tanks and I may just do it because I give a self-importance. So it is nothing, the self-preservation, the very natural instinct, which is a necessity, has covered up and clouded by a phony value of idealism. I may put a question on that. I'm scared by that self-importance that has so shrewd and cunning to take different kind of masks, because the essence of the self is the thinking process of the thought or the thinker. That's the self. The essence of the self is the thought and the deceiving thinking of the thought.
Yes, well, that's really the problem. Why we cannot think straight about the self. You see, why we cannot act in a coherent way, and perhaps we'll pursue that again tomorrow.
Thank you very much.